So, for the 20 or so of you who watch these videos, let's talk about the end of The Stranger. I'll summarize it a little, but if you're unclear about who the characters are and how they specifically interact with each other, you should go back into the book or a more thorough summary online to prepare for the test on Monday for those elements of the test. So, all of Chapter 5 of Part 2 takes place within a new prison cell in which Merceau is placed after he is sentenced to death. You may have noticed that the book does not even end with Merceau's execution actually taking place, but only with him imagining it. And this is not so surprising, however, given how much the novel seems to be much more interested in the internal thoughts and feelings of Merceau than with what actually happens or exists. Even his exchange with the chaplain is concerned with Merceau and others' belief in God, rather than in any facts about God and reality. When Merceau snaps at the chaplain, he doesn't defend only a view of reality, but his particular experience and judgment of it, saying, "But I was sure about me, about everything, surer than he could ever be, sure of my life and sure of the death I had waiting for me. Yes, that was all I had, but at least I had as much of a hold on it as it had on me." This fits with the broader concern of existentialists who are not only interested in existence apart from the mind, but are deeply interested in the psychological aspect of existence and see them as inextricably linked. It is worth pointing out, especially in light of Merceau's claim that nothing mattered, that the French word sens can mean both sense, a feeling or perception as in my ears sense sound or I sense a change in the wind, and meaning or direction, kind of like in the English expression to make sense of something. Thus, even though Merceau claims that there is no real meaning, that nothing makes sense, he sure senses a lot of things that we keep hearing about throughout the novel, whether it be heat or pleasure or drowsiness. To ignore or downplay the sensory perceptions and psychological experiences of people as less important than the external world of relations, like justice, and matter is for the existentialist to get existence backwards. Because before any of us can deal with the things existing apart from us in the outside world, we first experience our own existence. Now, before Merceau blows up at the chaplain near the end of Chapter 5, we read about him having difficulty accepting the reality of his situation, specifically what he calls the arrogant certainty of his sentence that he just couldn't accept. He claims there really was something ridiculously out of proportion between the verdict such certainty was based on and the imperturbable march of events from the moment the verdict was announced. The fact that the sentence had been read at 8 o'clock at night and not at 5 o'clock, the fact that it could have been an entirely different one, the fact that it had been decided by men who changed their underwear, the fact that it had been handed down in the name of some vague notion called the French, or German, or Chinese people. All of it seemed to detract from the seriousness of the decision. I was forced to admit, however, that from the moment it had been passed, its consequences became as real and as serious as the wall against which I pressed the length of my body. Now, a philosophical term that describes reality which is not necessary, reality which could be otherwise, is contingent. So, for example, I look at an apple and I ask, well, why is the apple this red and not redder? Or why is it this big and not bigger? Because I recognize that it's not ontologically necessary, that this apple happens to exist the way it is, or even to exist at all. And yet it does exist. Now, in contrast, are necessary things, like 2 plus 2 necessarily equals 4, and could not ever equal something else. Contingency applies to apples and events just as much as to the existence of Merceau and other human beings. We can easily imagine them existing otherwise, or not at all, unlike math. Now, this experience of contingency, of non-necessary existence, is something that all existentialists are very concerned with. While theistic existentialists, those who believe in God, tend to see our existence as something to be thankful for, atheistic existentialists view it as a problem or a burden to be dealt with. Camus, being one of the latter, sees our existence as something that has no inherent or objective meaning, but which nonetheless we can make the most of by constructing meaning for ourselves. Remember Sisyphus and the whole myth we talked about with him. Thus, one possible interpretation of the end of the novel is that by identifying his own indifference with that of the material world, a world that doesn't care how and whether or not people die or suffer or delight in sensory pleasure, Meursault imagined that the hatred of others towards him at his execution will make him not one of society's members, whose meanings he rejects, but kin of the world that is indifferent and as uncaring as he is. Now, one last thing to touch on in this chapter is Meursault's reflections on his father and execution in contrast to his interaction with the chaplain and religion in the book. Now, like Camus in real life, Meursault never knew his father. Yet Meursault reveals that the only thing that he might know about his father is the story told by his mother, that his father went to watch an execution and came back sick to his stomach. Now, while before his ordeal, Meursault had been disgusted by his father from this story, he now understands that there was nothing more important than an execution, and that when you come right down to it, it was the only thing a man could truly be interested in. He even goes so far as to think, if I ever get out of this prison, I would go and watch every execution there was. Now, while he stops himself because he knows that escape isn't a possibility for him, the insight is somewhat mysterious, and maybe even contradictory. Now, earlier we saw the examining magistrate hold up a crucifix telling him that the criminals who have come before me have always wept at the sight of this image of suffering. And yet Meursault did not. Meursault likewise refuses to see the chaplain and claims that God didn't interest him. Yet, the crucifix is the image of a man being executed, which Christians devote time and thought contemplating and looking at, similar to what Meursault claims he would do if he got the chance. Whether this represents a real contradiction, or a paradox, or just a difference in constructing and applying meaning to different things, is not immediately clear from the text, and is something just to consider. Apparent contradictions in how characters act and what they say are often puzzles that can be fun and interesting to try and explore and explain. When we read Hamlet, we'll see that Hamlet talks to an actual ghost who tells him about the afterlife it experiences. Yet a little later, in the famous To Be or Not to Be soliloquy, Hamlet calls death the undiscovered country, from whose bourne no traveler returns. Why does Hamlet say no one knows what happens after death, since no one has died and returned to tell about it, after he literally talked to someone who does just that? That will be something to think about when you read it, and you might think about how things don't quite line up with what Meursault says in this case too. So with that, I hope you all gain some better understanding from these videos. I commend those of you who watch them, since it shows that you take your education seriously enough to at least follow directions, if not take a genuine interest in learning a little more about what's offered. I've tried to make this video and the last one shorter for you guys, and I wish you the best of luck on your test.